it'd be very easy for them to say, this is my position on this issue, and here's why.
If you want to be a faithful shepherd, you need to be willing to discuss hard topics. We're going to talk today about what it takes to talk in a responsible, faithful way, in a way that edifies the church, analyze how some shepherds are doing it right now, and critique it, as well as offer a way forward. I'm Cody Libolt. This is Jacob Brunton. Let's start with a clip from the Shepherds Conference from last Wednesday. This clip will give you an idea of who's involved and the kind of things that are at stake.
The rhetoric that's going on in places like T4G and the Gospel Coalition, you have been remarkably silent. It's one of those issues where I've only heard you speak on it in the Ask Anything sections when people ask you questions like I'm doing right now. And
yeah, I think the pushback is, I think that's what my whole life is speaking about. All my public ministry began dealing with these questions. So I do take a bit of offense, not personally, but I am not going to be forced into a Twitter conversation, 140 characters about these issues. I have been trying to lay out for 30 plus years an understanding of how evangelicals should engage the culture. And I cut my teeth apologetically confronting cultural Marxism and the entire network of issues of the left.
All right, that's a good place to pause. Jacob, thoughts on what he said there?
Yeah, I want to thank Mohler for the fact that he has such a legacy dealing with these issues in the past. But he, of all people, should know that it's not sufficient to deal with something in the past and leave it in the past if it is rearing its ugly head again in the present. And it's not sufficient to be silent about that in the present and just rely on past recordings or past resources or the memory of the past. It's true that he's done some good work on this. And even in that chapel Q&A that he mentioned, he gave a really great history lesson on the evils of sort of a social justice, critical race theory, cultural Marxism type ideology. But he made it all theoretical and he made it all historical. He didn't mention the contemporary dangers and the contemporary actors, even within the church, who are fighting to bring that ideology into the church. And so my thought as I was watching that back when he did it was it was a lot like watching James Comey list all the reasons that Hillary Clinton should be indicted and then not decide to indict her. It was like Mohler was listing all the reasons that we should be concerned about contemporary social justice movements within the church, and then stop short of saying, and now let's be concerned and start addressing these contemporary social justice movements within the church.
The Q&A is probably not available right now, but hopefully it will be available to everybody to look through and see the whole thing in a form that's not been edited or sanitized or anything like that. But this Q&A from ShepCon caught people's attention. And so one commenter, Todd Friel, was on his show, Wretched Radio, and he was describing his perspective. And he says, please, until this is worked through, let's not draw lines. And he's trying to argue that people should not just judge Mohler because he has not expressed his view totally clearly. Mohler says, I need to go to my partners at T4G and we need to talk through these issues and we need to draw lines. So that's a good sign from Mohler. And here's Todd Friel saying, please don't just throw away all of the credibility that these people have built over years and years of ministry. But here's the thing is, today, we need clarity. And so we're not arguing today that Dr. Mohler or any of the others on that stage have this or that motive. We have ideas about that, but the point of this video is we're just going to point out what it takes to be a faithful shepherd. So I have this position, Jacob, and it's if a man doesn't want the world to know what he believes in all clarity on relevant, timely, cultural topics, then he likely does not belong in Christian leadership. That just begins to look like somebody who's politicking rather than somebody who is most concerned that the truth be known and most concerned to shepherd other people. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think it's especially important when we're talking about cultural issues that are affecting the church, or even theological issues that are affecting the church, where there is controversy, there's ideological confusion, there's division. And we have all of that right now with the contemporary issues surrounding social justice. And there is a lot of confusion. And part of the reason for all of that confusion and the subsequent division is the lack of clarity from our Christian teachers and our Christian leaders, that they have been, as Phil Johnson pointed out, remarkably silent on these issues in the contemporary application of these issues. And that's what Christians need clarity on.
Something Phil Johnson pointed out is, good job, Dr. Mueller, on your program, talking all the time about what's going on in the news, in the secular culture. But what about when you see somebody that you're closely associated with saying something that raises a ton of flags if you're concerned about encroaching leftism, and that being the ideology that pastors are bringing to their people? So people that are closely associated with Mueller are saying these things. Mueller doesn't speak out. We know that there is an agreement that if somebody has worked at your seminary, you ought not to critique them. They have an agreement like that. But there's nothing stopping you from saying, I believe such and such is true. I believe such and such is false. And it makes you wonder, isn't it time? And so, Jacob, I think your article that just came out, christianintellectual.com/racism, is going to be one way forward. I think we should go through it together. It's called 7 Theses on Social Justice, Clear Definitions of Justice and Racism. So we're looking specifically at that racism issue. And you're showing this as really what they should have talked about on that stage at ShepCon. These are the kinds of things that people should be willing to say that they affirm.
Yeah, and even if not on that stage, Mueller mentioned he didn't want to be forced into discussing this on Twitter in 140 characters. And that's totally legitimate. I don't think anybody expects him to talk about this on Twitter. And maybe even you can make a good argument that the stage at the Q&A panel wasn't sufficient, that maybe you could say there wasn't enough time to really get into all the details. That may be the case. But there are plenty of other venues, especially for Mueller, to explain and expound on these issues. He's got a daily podcast where he gets into deep detail on similar issues. He is able to write articles. He preaches occasionally. So there are many venues where Mueller especially, but everyone else on that stage could address these issues. And this article I put together shortly after this Q&A came out because I noticed a lot of people saying, oh, that this is a really big topic. It's so convoluted. You can't expect anybody to be able to talk about it clearly. And I just don't think that that's the case. I think that the controversial issues, the issues of confusion, the pain points, you could say, for most Christians can be boiled down to several basic points. And it's as easy as saying, what do we believe about this point? And so I wrote out 7 theses on what we believe, and generally those people who are, quote unquote, on our side of this issue, what we generally believe on these 7 issues. And if anybody disagrees, including Dr. Mueller or Dever or Duncan or MacArthur or whoever else, then it would be very easy for them to say so. It would be very easy for them to say, this is my position on this issue, and here's why. Or here's where we agree, here's where we disagree. And so I wanted to just go through those points real quick, those theses, and show how easy it would be to just give your position on these issues.
As we get into these theses, I want to point out this principle that when there is a battle over ideology, the side that if the side that has the truth is going to win, the way it's going to win is when the issues are talked through with clarity. Clarity tends toward helping the truth win out. Whereas if it's muddied, if people say we just don't want to articulate our view with clarity, that has a tendency to allow false ideas to slip in. So it's so important that we get clarity, whether these statements are right or wrong. We put them forward as a useful tool. So how about this, Jacob? I'll read one, and if you want to add any comment before I move on.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So number 1, being in need does not give one a just claim against someone else. To say that it does undermines the justice of God in the gospel. Justice is deserved. Grace or charity is not.
So this is just a clear distinction between what justice and grace are, or justice and charity are, in relation to each other as human beings. And if you want more detail on this and on the next point, you can see my recent debate on social justice that I did with the Bible and Beer Consortium, which is posted on our YouTube channel.
Number 2, what we owe to God as justice should never be confused with what we owe to other people as justice.
And this is just making a clear distinction between God and other people. We owe certain things to God as justice, which we do not owe to other people as justice. And there are certain things that we owe to other people as justice, which we do not owe to God as justice. And we need to be able to think clearly about the distinctions there. And the application can get convoluted, and that's something that we can all talk about. But the principle needs to be that God is not other people are not God, and justice is different depending on who we're talking about.
This is relevant because among the more social justice type, there's a very common conflation between what you would call vertical and horizontal, and especially Tim Keller's generous justice attempts to show those as being the same, and you're going to argue no, they're different. So number 3, racism is the sin of ascribing undue significance to the color of someone's skin or to their biological lineage. Yeah.
So, and here there's been a lot of talk recently about racism being something other than this. And all I would say is that this definition of racism is what the majority of people functionally operate off of, especially in America. If you ask most people, what is racism and why is it evil? Their fundamental answer is it's judging people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And that's sort of to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., but it's not because it came from his mouth. It's because that's a very good summary of the evil of racism, judging people by the content or by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And the way I paraphrase it or summarize it is giving undue significance to the color of someone's skin. Now, if you want to call something else racism, then you need to acknowledge that you're changing the definition from what most people understand it as. And that's what we're going to get into as we go into these following points.
So number 4, to call anything less racism is to belittle the evil of actual racism and to unjustly level false accusations. Explain that.
Yeah, so since most people operate off of that definition of racism that I gave, the moral outrage that we as a society rightfully have against racism is based on that definition. It's based on, so when someone's accused of racism, we automatically have moral outrage towards them because we're thinking of them as judging someone by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. We're thinking of them as placing undue significance on the color of their skin. And we know that how evil that is. Everybody knows how evil that is. But if you don't mean that when you say racism, you mean something else, but you still are relying on people to have that same emotional reaction, that same outrage, then you are trading in a false accusation. You're equivocating on the term racism and relying on the ambiguity there to elicit that moral outrage that may not really be deserved because you're talking about something completely different.
Number 5 talks about systemic racism. It says, systemic racism occurs when a policy or person or persons of power within an institution implements practices which place undue significance on the color of people's skin or their biological lineage.
Yeah, so we want to affirm systemic racism exists. And that's often one of the objections leveled against the sort of anti-social justice side is to say, well, you don't believe in systemic racism. That's not true. We definitely believe in systemic racism. But we define it as an institution or a system that implements practices which place undue significance on the color of people's skin or on their biological lineage. In other words, an institution that has explicitly racist practices. So examples of this would be the Southern slave trade. That was explicitly racist, and it was a system of implementing racist practices. Another example was Jim Crow laws. Those were explicitly racist, and it was a system of institutionalized racist practices. So systemic racism exists where a system or an institution is implementing on a wide scale racist practices or policies or procedures.
I would add that if you are from Asia and you apply to Harvard, you will experience systemic racism. because they try to not allow any more Asian applicants than is represented by the general society. And test scores for Asians on average are higher. And so they actually, people that could have made the curve don't, because there was a quota.
Yeah, so quotas, affirmative action, and many other things would be examples of actual systemic racism that we currently have.
All right, number 6, mere statistical disparities are never sufficient evidence for concluding that systemic racism is at play.
This is really important. So you can't prove anything merely with statistics in terms of the underlying cause or motivation. And racism, systemic racism, is an explicitly racist policy or procedure. You can't prove just by disparities in outcome that the cause was some sort of racist practice or procedure. You need more than just a disparity of outcome. You don't know what else might have caused that. Now, if you do an in-depth analysis and you rule out all other possible causes, then you might have a good argument. But the mere statistical disparity in and of itself is never sufficient evidence for systemic racism.
There's many errors that can be made from statistics. So let's go on to number 7. One of the most abusive forms of injustice, which has become socially acceptable and even socially applauded, but which the church must condemn strongly and clearly, is the practice of trading in false accusations of racism or systemic racism, either due to a redefinition of racism or due to a complete lack of substantiating evidence for the accusations. This is the heaviest one. Tell me what this means.
This is really just the application point of a few of the above points that we just talked about. If the above is true, then one of the most accepted evils of our day, one of the most accepted injustices, social injustices of our day, is the false accusation of racism, whether it's personal or systemic. And this is something that the church, if we really care about justice and we really care about social justice, this is what the church needs to be concerned about, because this is what is socially acceptable today, and it absolutely should not be.
All right, that brings our video to a conclusion. I just want to say, Jacob, thank you for helping us think through what it would look like to talk through these issues actually, rather than just to talk about the fact that you have talked about them. Now, I know you're going to have some summarizing thoughts, but let's wrap it up for the application. What does a good shepherd do?
Yeah, so I want to point out, we're not saying a good shepherd necessarily agrees with all of those points that we just laid out. But a good shepherd does speak his mind on all of those issues. So a good shepherd will consolidate and identify the major issues of disagreement, the major issues of controversy, as we've done here, and then clearly state his position on those issues, and then do his best to explain why he believes those things on those issues, and then potentially defend his position on those issues. That's what Christians need. So maybe these shepherds would completely disagree with us on everything we just said about those issues. Great. Please say so. Please make it clear what you believe on these issues and why you believe it. Then we can move forward as a church. Until then, there's nothing but confusion and chaos, and that's not helpful.
All right, I'm Cody Libolt, and this is Jacob Brunton. Thank you for watching this today, and go to our site, christianintellectual.com, and go to /racism if you want to see Jacob's points and you want to use those yourself. There's also a lot of articles about Tim Keller's generous justice and about mercy versus justice and those kinds of things. Thank you, Jacob.